Religions and the Theory of Violence and Pacifism. Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to engage with a very complex and often controversial subject: the relationship between religion, violence, and pacifism. Religion has historically been both accused of fueling violence and praised as one of the world's greatest sources of peace and reconciliation. In this lecture, we'll cover 3 sections of the chapter. First, the introduction, where we define violence and pacifism and examine religion's dual role. Second, the theoretical frameworks that scholars have developed to explain violence. And third, some of the ways different religions approach violence in their sacred texts, their traditions, and their interpretations. Section 1. Introduction. Let's begin with a definition. Violence is not simply the act of harming another person physically. It encompasses much more. Violence includes psychological harm, sexual abuse, and structural violence, that is, systemic injustices and inequalities that may never raise a fist, but nevertheless wound communities deeply. Poverty, racism, exclusion, and deprivation can all be forms of violence. In contrast, pacifism is the deliberate rejection of violence as a way to solve problems. A pacifist does not simply avoid fighting, they actively commit themselves to peace. Pacifism may range from absolute nonviolence, the conviction that violence can never be justified, to more conditional forms, such as anti-war movements that oppose specific conflicts while still recognizing the legitimacy of self-defense. What unites pacifists is their search for alternative virtues: tolerance, mercy, and cooperation. Here is the tension. Religion sits on both sides of the spectrum. On one hand, religions have been implicated in terrible acts of violence, wars of conquest, sectarian strife, terrorism, and persecution. The very nature of exclusive truth claims, we are right and others are wrong, has fueled hostility throughout history. On the other hand, religions have also been the world's great peacemakers. They provide moral frameworks that encourage forgiveness, reconciliation, and healing. They raise leaders who serve as mediators, who inspire nonviolence, and who transform conflict into peace. So, as we move forward, keep this paradox in mind. Religion can be both a sword and a salve. Section 2. Theoretical frameworks. To understand violence and its relationship with religion, we turn to 3 influential thinkers: René Girard, Max Weber, and Walter Benjamin. René Girard, the scapegoat theory. Girard argued that violence arises from what he called mimetic desire. We desire not because we inherently want something, but because we see others wanting it. This imitation produces rivalry and jealousy, which then spiral into conflict. Societies, he said, need a release valve for this tension, and they often find it in the mechanism of scapegoating. The scapegoat is chosen not because they are guilty, but because they are different, vulnerable, or convenient. By punishing or expelling them, society temporarily restores order. Think of the Oedipus myth. A plague devastates Thebes, and Oedipus is cast out as the cause, even though he is more victim than villain. Girard points out that myths across cultures disguise this cycle, presenting scapegoating as divinely ordained. But the Bible, he argued, breaks this cycle. In the Gospels, Jesus is portrayed as the innocent scapegoat, falsely condemned, whose death exposes the injustice of scapegoating rather than justifying it. This was a turning point in human history. Instead of sacralizing violence, Christianity unmasks it. Girard also points to historical cases, like the Black Death, where Jews were blamed for poisoning wells, leading to massacres. These are scapegoat patterns, societies projecting their fears onto marginalized groups. His insight shows us how deeply violence is woven into culture, and how religion can either conceal or expose this truth. Max Weber, The Monopoly of Violence. Now, turning to political sociology, Max Weber gives us a very different perspective. In his famous lecture, Politics as a Vocation, he said, "The state is the human community that claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory." What does this mean? It doesn't mean that only the state can use violence. Individuals or groups may use violence, but what matters is legitimacy. Violence only becomes legitimate when it is authorized by the state and recognized as rightful by the population. Without legitimacy, violence is seen as mere coercion. Weber shows us that modern states are distinguished from earlier systems, like feudalism, precisely because they centralize and regulate violence. This makes them capable of enforcing order, protecting citizens, and maintaining stability. Yet, the state's monopoly can be undermined by rebels, criminal groups, or private armies, but such violence lacks legitimacy. So, Weber pushes us to consider, when is violence considered lawful, and who has the authority to decide that? Walter Benjamin, Mythic versus Divine Violence. Finally, Walter Benjamin presents a profound distinction between 2 types of violence: Mythic violence, violence that creates and preserves law. It is arbitrary, based on force, not justice. It justifies itself by power alone. Think of the Greek myth of Niobe, punished by the gods with no moral reasoning, just raw power. Divine violence, violence that breaks unjust laws and exposes the corruption of power. Benjamin says it is bloodless, in contrast to the bloody myths. Divine violence doesn't create new laws. It wipes away systems of injustice altogether. It is revolutionary, messianic, and transformative. For Benjamin, moments of resistance, like workers striking against oppressive powers, can embody divine violence. Here, violence isn't perpetuating power, it is dissolving it, pointing toward justice beyond law. Together, Girard, Weber, and Benjamin offer us complementary lenses. Violence as cultural scapegoating, as state authority, and as a contest between oppressive law and transcendent justice. Section 3. Religious approaches to violence. Now, let's see how these theories play out in the live traditions of the world's religions. 3.1 Sacred Texts and Interpretations. The Bible offers us both sides of the story. The Old Testament includes divine commands for war and episodes of shocking brutality, stonings, massacres, conquest narratives. Yet it also provides ideals of peace, creation as shalom, prophetic visions of harmony, and ethical calls for justice. In the New Testament, Jesus preaches forgiveness, love of enemies, and non-retaliation in the Sermon on the Mount. Early Christianity leaned toward pacifism, though later developed the just war theory as a compromise. In Judaism, violence is often seen as a distortion of God's peaceful creation. Commands to annihilate enemies are read by many Jewish scholars as hyperbole or historically bound, not eternal laws. Rabbinic tradition emphasizes repentance, justice, and community peace. In the Qur'an, verses like the so-called sword verse, Jinn 9:5, are often cited as inciting violence. But Islamic scholars stress context. Many verses restrict fighting to defense and end with calls to cease hostilities once peace is possible. The Qur'an also insists there is no compulsion in religion. Jihad itself is a broad concept, meaning striving, encompassing both inner moral struggle and, in limited cases, defensive war. Hindu scriptures also present contradictions. The Vedas contain calls for the destruction of enemies, while the Bhagavad Gita frames war as a sacred duty when dharma is at stake. Yet Hinduism also elevates ahimsa, or non-violence, as a spiritual principle. Buddhism is famous for its commitment to compassion and non-harm. The Pali Canon emphasizes avoiding killing, cultivating loving kindness, and overcoming hatred. Yet, in practice, Buddhist chronicles like the Mahavamsa depict kings waging wars for the sake of the faith. Some tantric traditions even include violent rituals. So, once again, a dual legacy. What becomes clear is that interpretation matters. A literal reading of sacred texts can lead to rigid pacifism or rigid violence. Allegorical or contextual readings often soften the violent passages, reinterpreting them as symbolic, historical, or bound to a specific context. Exegesis, how communities choose to read their texts, becomes decisive in whether religion justifies violence or advocates peace. 3.2 Violence as defense of faith or order religions have often sacralized violence under certain conditions. In Islam, jihad was historically codified into rules: fight defensively, avoid harming civilians, and seek peace if possible. Extremist misuse today often distorts this rich legal tradition. In Christianity, the Crusades were framed as a holy pilgrimage combined with warfare, sanctifying violence with promises of spiritual reward. Yet they left a legacy of bloodshed and ethical ambiguity. In Hinduism, dharma, yuddha, or righteous war, demanded strict rules. No attacking innocents, no deceit, no cruelty. War was allowed only as a last resort to defend dharma. 3.3 Rituals and sacralization of violence. Finally, Girard's theory reappears in the way religions ritualize violence. Sacrifices, punishments, and divine retribution are often framed as God's justice, maintaining cosmic and moral order. In Judaism and Christianity, divine punishment is balanced by mercy and salvation. In other traditions, ritualized violence symbolically contains human aggression. Teachings on nonviolence, ahimsa, in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. Let's start with one of the most important ethical concepts in world religions: ahimsa, meaning non-violence or non-injury. Hinduism. Ahimsa is the first of the yamas, or moral restraints, in the Yoga Sutras. It calls for non-harm, not only in action, but in thought and speech as well. Historically, it led to practices like vegetarianism and shaped Hindu spirituality. Gandhi took this principle and made it a powerful tool for political struggle through satyagraha, or non-violent resistance, which helped India gain independence. But Hinduism also balances ahimsa with social duty. Sometimes self-defense or dharmic responsibility is permitted. What we see in these traditions is that pacifism is not a passive ideal. It requires daily discipline, deep ethical reflection, and even lifestyle choices. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Christianity's foundation of pacifism is found most clearly in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 5-7. Here, Jesus lays out a radical ethic. Blessed are the peacemakers. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. These teachings overturn the logic of retaliation and vengeance. Instead of escalating violence, Jesus calls for reconciliation, forgiveness, and enemy love. He reframes righteousness not as strict legalism, but as wholehearted peacemaking. The sermon also emphasizes humility, prayer, and trust in God's provision. It culminates with the golden rule: do to others what you would have them do to you. For Christians, this is not just an ethic of nonviolence, but a vision of a new kind of community shaped by God's radical love. 4.2 Historical movements. The Quaker movement. In 17th century England, George Fox and his followers, later called Quakers, declared that they utterly deny all outward wars. This became their peace testimony. Quakers refused to fight, even when persecuted themselves. In Pennsylvania, William Penn sought to build a holy experiment on peace and fair treatment of Native Americans. Over time, Quakers linked their pacifism with other social causes. They were leaders in the abolition of slavery, in women's rights, and in social justice. Their witness to peace became a way of life, not just an abstract idea. Mennonites. Emerging from the Anabaptist tradition in the 16th century, Mennonites also embraced pacifism. Rooted in the teachings of Jesus, they rejected military service, swearing oaths, and any form of violence. Instead, they devoted themselves to alternative service, medical aid, relief work, disaster response. The Mennonite Central Committee, founded in 1920, became a global force for peace and humanitarian work. For Mennonites, pacifism is not only about saying no to war, it's about saying yes to active service, compassion, and community witness. Vietnamese Buddhist monks. During the Vietnam War, Buddhist monks protested government repression and violence. Their acts of nonviolent resistance included hunger strikes, public demonstrations, and, most famously, self-immolation, such as Thich Quang Duc in 1963. Rather than harming others, they turned violence inward on themselves as a form of moral protest. Thich Nhat Hanh became a global voice for peace, developing engaged Buddhism, which called Buddhists not only to meditate, but to act for justice and peace in society. Khudai Khidmatgar. In colonial India, among the Pashtuns, Abdul Ghaffar Khan, known as the Frontier Gandhi, founded the Khudai Khidmatgar, or Servants of God. They wore red shirts and pledged to fight British oppression with absolute non-violence. Like Gandhi, they saw non-violence as a weapon of the strong, rooted in both Islam and Pashtun honor. Though brutally suppressed after partition, their movement left a legacy of courage, discipline, and faith in peaceful resistance. 4.3 Mysticism and Personal Transformation. Finally, mysticism across religions offers a unique kind of pacifism, an inner transformation that turns potential violence into spiritual growth. Mystics teach that the real battlefield is inside us. Aggression, anger, and rivalry must be faced within our own souls. Through practices of contemplative prayer, meditation, fasting, and self-denial, mystics redirect destructive impulses towards spiritual transformation. John of the Cross spoke of the dark night of the soul, where suffering and struggle are endured inwardly and transformed into greater union with God. Buddhist meditation cultivates compassion, dissolving the illusion of separation between self and other, so harming another becomes like harming oneself. Mysticism reframes conflict. Instead of projecting violence outward, mystics endure, integrate, and transform it. The result is resilience, peace, and deep compassion that radiates outward into society. Buddhism. Here, ahimsa is woven into the heart of Buddhist practice. The 5 precepts begin with a simple command: do not kill, but it goes deeper. Nonviolence in Buddhism is not just about refraining from harm. It is about cultivating metta, loving kindness, and karuna, compassion, for all beings. It is both external and internal. You do not strike others, and you do not harbor hatred within yourself. The story of Angulimala, a mass murderer transformed by meeting the Buddha, shows how even those immersed in violence can be brought to peace. Jainism. Nowhere is ahimsa more radical than in Jainism. For Jains, all living beings, even the tiniest microbes, have souls. Violence against any life form creates karma that traps the soul in rebirth. So, Jains go to extraordinary lengths to avoid harm, sweeping paths so as not to crush insects, filtering water to avoid killing organisms. Ahimsa here is not only a discipline, but the very path to liberation. So far, we've seen how religion can justify violence, sections 1-3, and how it can also inspire profound pacifism, section 4. But real life is rarely neat and tidy. Religion doesn't fit into a simple binary of violent or peaceful. Instead, it exists in tension, a space where the same scriptures, leaders, and communities can foster both reconciliation and conflict. In this final section, we'll explore these tensions and ambiguities. We'll look at how religion and politics are intertwined, how violence is sometimes sacralized through rhetoric, and yet also how religious leaders have played powerful roles in peace building. Religion and politics intertwined. One of the first ambiguities is this: religion and politics are rarely separate. In fact, they often reinforce each other.